Right at the heart of the world's largest democracy, a massive looming shift is approaching. We're talking about India and a constitutional deadline hitting in 2026 that could fundamentally redraw the map of political power. It's one of those issues where demographic shifts, constitutional law, and raw political leverage are about to collide in a spectacular way. So I want you to think about this question for a second. What happens when following the rules actually costs you your political power? It's an existential crisis that India is facing right now as it prepares to update its parliamentary seats. And to really grasp why this is such a high stakes puzzle, we first need to understand the mechanism that's actually causing it. And that mechanism is called delimitation. Simply put, it's the constitutional mandate to readjust legislative seats and territorial boundaries to match the latest census. Think of it like slicing a pie for a dinner party. As more guests arrive or move around the table, you have to cut the slices differently, so everyone gets a fair share. As populations grow and shift, the political map has to be redrawn so that every single citizen's vote carries roughly the same weight. Okay, to make sense of this complex constitutional journey, we're going to break it down step by step. First, we'll look at the Great Seat Freeze. Then we'll get into the clash of democracy versus federalism, followed by real-life state divides, misconceptions about the new bill, and finally, finding the right balance. All right, Section 1, the Great Seat Freeze. Why exactly hasn't this pie been re-sliced since 1971? Okay, let's dive into this. Originally, the Indian Constitution commanded a pretty straightforward readjustment after every single census. And in the early decades of the Republic, India scrupulously updated its seats. But then, in 1976, right in the middle of an intensive nationwide family planning campaign, the 42nd Amendment froze the total strength and statewide distribution of Lok Sabha seats based on the 1971 census. Now, this was just supposed to be a pause until 2001. But when 2001 finally rolled around, the 84th Amendment kicked the can down the road again, extending that freeze all the way to the first census taken after 2026. The absolutely crucial point here is that the population freeze was always intended to be a temporary pause to encourage family planning. It was never meant to be a permanent constitutional rule. It deferred the constitutional duty, it didn't extinguish it. But by hitting the pause button for half a century, successive governments accidentally set the stage for a massive democratic deficit, which leads us directly into our next core conflict. Moving to Section 2, Democracy versus Federalism, the clash of constitutional values. This right here is the philosophical conflict at the very heart of this explainer. It brilliantly illustrates the tension between two equally valid principles: electoral equality against federalism. On one hand, democracy demands one person, one vote, one value. It's a strictly egalitarian principle. But on the other hand, the federal promise ensures that constituent states retain a meaningful collective voice and identity in the national legislature. Right now, these two values are on a collision course. And to understand why we can't just ignore one for the sake of the other, we really have to look at the legal bedrock of India. That bedrock is the basic structure doctrine. Stemming from the landmark 1973 Kesavana-Davardi case, this doctrine basically dictates that there are essential, unbreakable foundations of the Constitution that Parliament literally cannot alter or destroy, even with its amending powers. And what makes this so fascinating is that both democracy and federalism are protected basic features. In past rulings, the Supreme Court declared that federalism is absolutely essential. But in other rulings, they've said democracy and equal vote values are also essential. So as you can see, we are dealing with a grand constitutional dilemma here, not just some simple math problem. Any change to legislative seats directly impacts two unbreakable rules at the exact same time. Which brings us to Section 3, Real-Life State Divides, the Tale of Demographic Divergence. Let's look at how this actually plays out on the ground, because this is the reality of the situation today. Since the 1970s, southern states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala successfully followed union family planning policies. They invested heavily in health and education, and they stabilized their populations. As a result, under that 1971 freeze, they currently hold more seats than their actual modern population share would warrant. Meanwhile, large northern states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar continued to see rapid population growth, meaning they currently hold way fewer seats than their massive population share dictates. This divergence creates a profound moral argument. As the research notes, to penalize them now is sent to invert the logic of cooperative federalism and to create a perverse disincentive for good governance. Think about it. If you update the seats strictly based on today's population alone, states that successfully implemented the government's own population control policies end up losing their relative political power, and the states that didn't gain power. Okay, let's move to Section 4, Misconceptions about the Bill, the 131st Amendment solution. So how exactly is the government planning to tackle this looming expiration head-on? Well, the solution lies in the Constitution 131st Amendment Bill 2026. Now, what's really interesting here is that this bill, alongside the Delimitation Bill, proposes massive physical changes to the makeup of the Indian Parliament just to soften the blow of redrawing the map. The absolute most striking proposal is the number 850. The bill seeks to substantially raise the maximum strength of the Lok Sabha to 850 seats. That breaks down to 815 for states and 35 for union territories. By making the pie that much larger, the idea is that even if the proportions change, no state actually loses seats in absolute numbers. On top of that, this delimitation exercise acts as the trigger for another historic change. Upon completion, it will officially activate a monumental 33% reservation of seats for women in the House of the People and legislative assemblies. It's a provision introduced by a previous amendment, but it's been waiting on this exact new census mapping to actually take effect. But looking past the expanded seats and historic reservations, we really have to ask ourselves, does simply counting heads to assign seats automatically destroy India's federal structure? There's a super common misconception out there that population-based representation is inherently a threat to federalism. But constitutionally speaking, equal representation is the default. Realigning seats to match the population isn't the threat itself, it's just a basic democratic requirement. The real constitutional vulnerabilities, the actual threats to the basic structure of federalism, lie entirely in how this counting is executed. For instance, the 2026 bills give Parliament the power to select which census to use by a simple majority. That means they could theoretically choose an outdated 2011 census instead of the latest post-2026 data. Plus, the suddenness of the redistribution, combined with a weakening of deliberative checks, like reducing the Council of States' relative control, is what could truly erode the federal voice of those disadvantaged states. The danger is all in the execution. And that leads us to our final section, finding the right balance, reconciling representation and federation. So, if we need to update the seats, but we absolutely can't strip states of their voice, what's the path forward? Well, the research outlines 3 specific practical steps that act as compensatory mechanisms to protect state federalism. First, follow through on enlarging the House so no state suffers an absolute seat loss. Second, apply digressive proportionality, which is a constitutional tool that intentionally mitigates pure per capita equality to protect smaller or demographically consistent states. And third, reinforce other federal institutions, like granting a genuinely representative Council of States and ensuring adequate fiscal decentralization. The key takeaway here is absolutely vital. The basic structure doctrine protects the essential identity of federalism. It doesn't protect a frozen 1971 seat ratio. The Constitution requires a fair process and proportion. It definitely doesn't permit the indefinite suspension of equal representation, but it also doesn't allow a reallocation so abrupt that it just hollows out the state's constitutional voice. Ultimately, we can achieve equal votes without punishing states for their successful governance. As the author beautifully summarizes, the constitutional question is answered not by choosing democracy over federalism or the reverse, but by designing an exercise faithful to both. It's really not about picking a winner here. It's about carefully threading the needle of India's incredibly unique quasi-federal identity. Which leaves us with this final massive thought to ponder. Will this post-2026 delimitation exercise successfully balance equal votes with state power, or will it permanently shift the center of gravity in the world's largest democracy? The framework is there, the bills are drafted, and the expiration date is fast approaching. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex and totally fascinating topic today. I really hope this explainer helped make the roadmap ahead perfectly clear.